Hi, Simon.
Hey Lisa,
How's
what's
it going?
been
No. After 27 episodes, we still step on each other. So you tell me what's going on. What have you been thinking about? What's on your mind?
well, I was thinking, I've been thinking a lot. I started a new role about 2 months ago, and I came into a situation, for lack of a better word, where there's a lot of paper and there's a lot of stuff around, but there's not a lot of process.
Hmm.
And it's interesting that it was a very old school sort of process. It's around trusts and grants, and without getting too technical, they can be pretty tricky legally. You have to provide a lot of background material. And everything I've been finding is sort of like all over the place. Like it could be scanned and digital, but a lot of it's in a file folder. There's not really a flow or a process for it. And also, I think there's a team of people who are just doing the work because they just have to jump in and get stuff done. It's a very lean
Hmm.
team.
Hmm.
And no one's come in and sort of said, well, if we do add some process or add a little bit of structure or, you know, we could actually be more effective because when
Hmm.
it becomes a little cleaner, you understand what you're supposed to be doing, what you're working towards, but also it basically, in a sense, it's reproducible, right? You can just
Hmm.
duplicate it. So you do it
Predictable.
once. And so one of the things that I've been sort of helping with or thinking about is like having certain pieces of content, certain narratives about the programs that are this company or this nonprofit offers. And how can we keep that updated, organized so that it's literally like you just follow a process once you have the recipe to create like a grant document, right?
Hmm.
Or talk to somebody about the programs and things like that. And it got me thinking a lot too about what you and I have experienced, which is like people coming to us. You're a designer. I worked on the web. People would literally be like, oh, well, I have access to Photoshop. I have access to Squarespace. I have access to WordPress. I'll just make the web page or I'll just create the graphic or, and it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, what do you do? Why? Like, it's always that question. We all can figure out how to do it, but you need to understand why and what are you solving? What's that problem? Right. And helping people sort of step back and instead of jumping in with all these self-service tools, which are sort of a blessing and a curse,
Yeah.
to having a little more strategy and structure, right?
Hmm. It's funny, as you were saying that, I was actually thinking of an example of somebody that I did some work for. They wanted to redesign their website, and their previous website was on WordPress. And as a friend of mine would call it, it was a pre-Civil War era website. You know what I'm talking
Okay.
about?
Yeah.
So, and he was very proud of it. And he also created his logo in PowerPoint, and he was proud of that too. And I'm
Nice.
like, just because you created it doesn't mean that it's good. And so, I hired a designer to help with the logo. I redesigned the website to make the customer experience a lot better. And I think it's a case of just because you have the tools available to you, people think that they can just jump in and just create whatever. But I think the purpose of what we're talking about today is having a plan and what would go into it, and especially for creative. So you and I both talked about websites as an example, but if we think about creative and what goes into, how do I know it's going to be the best thing
Right.
possible?
Effective. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, if you're designing a garage sale flyer from a template, it's probably going to be
Who
okay. But
cares?
if
Yeah.
you're trying to generate revenue, you're trying to engage people and move them through the funnel, whatever it is, right? You're right. You need some sort of thought. You have to think about it. And I think just like you were saying, strategy doesn't have to be super formal,
Hmm.
right? But it needs to be, you need to be thinking about like, what are you trying to achieve and who is your audience? Who are you targeting? And what are the key things you want to say? I've had so many people dump projects on me in the web world and say, I need a web page. It's like, well, do you really need a
What's
web
its
page? Or,
right?
yeah,
What's its
because
purpose?
we might have something already created or something that we can adjust to suit both needs, kind of thing. So let's go back to specifically digital, or sorry, not digital, but digital, I guess, in this day and age, right? Design, what, what would you say, like in a very sort of brief way, what is a creative brief? Ah, brief way.
A
In a
brief way.
concise
What is a
way.
creative, concise way? Yeah, and so you also said process doesn't have to be, or strategy doesn't have to be this, super formal thing. And I feel that's the same with a brief. It depends on the magnitude of what it is that you're doing, but like a creative brief would be, you want to make sure you're just putting down in writing what are my goals, what are the expectations, are there, who am I targeting for this, what is the messaging, if it's a specific deliverable, like if it's like I'm just creating a flyer for a garage sale. We'll use that as an example. So maybe the design part doesn't necessarily have to be great, but you have to have the information. You have to say what the date is. You have to say where it is. Like there's certain things that you have to have. And so making sure you identify the criteria. And
Hmm.
I would say for small businesses and other organizations, your brand is a consideration as well. So,
Hmm.
and then it's also something, if you have multiple people helping you with this, it's just a thing for you to refer back to. It's just kind of like,
Right.
here's what we talked about. So if you're going off, like if it's not mapping to that, then it's off the mark. We're out of scope, or it's like it's not covering it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, having people aligned and agree this is
Hmm.
what we're doing is
Hmm.
so helpful, because guess what happens if you don't do that? Rework, like you said, and
Yeah,
constant
totally.
churn, and you never deliver, right?
Exactly. And you talked about process, and I always think of it as predictable and repeatable is like why you would do
Exactly.
that. And so if it's if it's predictable, then you don't have to worry about like, are we actually doing this correctly, and that kind of thing. So it becomes a way to make your execution much more efficient.
Right.
And I alluded to managing scope, and then maintaining brand kind of consistency there as well. Yeah, I think of, there's so many times. Like, I think there's, no, I just was thinking about how there's plenty of times when that doesn't exist. And I think it's more true in the small business world where people are like, oh, I have an event I want to promote. I'm going to grab a template on Canva. I'm going to create a flyer, and then I'm going to put it everywhere. And okay, so is that flyer consistent with all the other flyers or all the other, communication that you have for your brand? Probably not, because you weren't thinking of it holistically. You were just
Hmm.
developing it in isolation and not really putting any thought into it. So, do you have any examples? Like, even you said you just this role that you have, like, whenever I come into it's like a new job or a new project, there's always stuff that I uncover that it's kind of like, we need to redo this because it's not following. It's usually brand, and then it's
Yeah.
also not identifying the right, like what's the purpose. Like
Yeah.
sometimes that's not even identified.
I think
Like, why are
that
we doing this?
there's some in my particular case, there's um projects and programs that were launched but then died. They didn't
Hmm.
weren't effective when they went out into the real world. And so some of that is still referenced in the narratives that I have to look at and consider. So, it's really, I think it's partly cleanup too. There's just, some housekeeping. It's not necessarily the function of a brief, but a brief would tell you this is these are the right things. These are the current things. These are, what we should focus on, not don't focus on this old stuff, things like that. So I feel like a brief is a great way too to move forward, and make sure that you're sort of thinking about, again, think. Like it comes down to like taking that time to like just consider what you want to try to say instead of just sort of blurting out stuff, right?
I think
Um,
that's what usually happens, and especially in small businesses, you're like, you just have to get it done, and especially if it's just you're just like, okay, I'm just gonna go grab a template and just do it, and just pause and think about it. I think it's a good idea to put your thoughts in writing, just to say. this is who I'm targeting. Because then you might go, oh, I don't need to add that information, or even in an email. Like I feel like there's all kinds of briefs you can create if you are developing external communications, even internal in some cases.
Yeah.
But I think there's different levels of what information would go into a brief depending on how kind of minor, like again, it's
Well,
a
I think it's
brush.
a, yeah, if it's a brand new like holiday campaign, like you and I have been there, right? That
Mm-hmm.
is a full detailed brief, right? Even if you're a small business, if you're specific
Yeah.
seasonal things that you want to really like crush, you have to really have a fully detailed brief that maybe covers all aspects of creative that you might update your website with, creative that you might update email with, creative for
Well, let's
social. And
let's ponder on this particular level. Go ahead.
okay, well, I was just going to hit on the other
Keep
couple
going.
other levels
No,
just so
I
that
don't
there
want to
was
go to the level, not yet. So let's
all
stay on this big level one first, because
right, big
you
level one.
mentioned like a holiday campaign. I also think if let's say you're launching a new program, that requires to me some other like thoughts on what, it's bigger. Like
Hmm.
it might not just be, maybe there's an overall brief for the, like, what's the purpose of why we're doing this, and then there might be other briefs for different tactics maybe. So let's say you're like, okay, well, we're going to create a logo for this program, so that's like a thing, and that maybe there's a creative brief for that alone, and then
Right.
maybe there's another one of like an email brief. We're going to communicate to our customers to let them know that we have this, and so that might be another brief. So it can be tiered in a way, but that first one, it's kind of big, a lot of things, and then go ahead with the next couple of levels.
Okay. Well, you sort of touched on it. Like if you're iterating, so let's say you create creative for Mother's Day and now you do creative for Father's Day, right? Or maybe you do stuff for tax season and then you want to do stuff for the end of year, planning and forecasting for the next tax year.
Mm.
Those could be iterations of the same thing. You might want to
Hmm.
leverage stuff that you one know works, right? You put it out there. Again, you tracked it, you tested it, you got some input, you know how effective it is. Obviously, if
Yep.
something is not effective, don't base don't do it again, right? Definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. But
Yep.
normally you can iterate. That's a much smaller, brief process, right? You have something to reflect on. And I think then there's the like basic, which is I just need to update this. Like in the
Hmm.
case of like a blog post or a
Hmm.
web
Hmm.
homepage image, or it probably still should be brief. So you have, to your point, you have two things. You have it documented. Why are you doing this? Right?
Hmm.
What's driving updating an image or whatever? And then, why? Like who is this really? What's the end expectation?
Yes. And for that last one, where it's just kind of like a minor thing, I was just thinking there are plenty of cases where clients that I'm working with now, where they might have a request for something. So they're not filling out a brief, but they might ask, oh, I need this thing. And then I ask questions. And the
Hmm.
questions are basically getting at the things that you're talking. Who's this for? It's, if
Right.
you understand all that stuff, it's basically a brief. It's just not formal. So I
So
think there might be different depending on who you work with and what their style is. Maybe they don't want to do that. I don't want to fill out a form. And it's like, that's probably okay. If you're the one that has to interpret it and you have a good relationship with them, you probably know. Or again, if you're an agency partner or a consultant like me and Simon, then I think that you know the right kinds of questions to ask to make something effective.
where do you think most small business owners think their projects fall on those three tiers?
Probably the middle or the bottom.
And why is that?
I just don't think that there are as big campaigns.
Okay.
I mean, once in a while, sure. I mean, I think it's also probably the top ones are the tier one. I don't even know what to call it, but like the big ones, you're
Mm-hmm.
not going to do them that often. So they might be once or twice a
Mm.
year or something like that.
Okay.
but even still, to your point, maybe you're reusing them. So even at Roku, we had a holiday campaign every year. We kind of had the same, it's like the concept might have been different. So we might have needed to say, okay, how can we make whatever our creative theme is across all of our marketing assets? How can we make those look different? But I think the general gist of it was always the same, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Loosely?
maybe. I would
Yeah.
say people by and large volunteer too, because they, if they're thinking a creative brief and it's a project,
Mm-hmm.
that's what the level that they should document at. Kind
Mm-hmm.
of the, I think what happens, like you said, with tier three is it's literally update this for me or change this
Yeah.
for me,
Yeah.
or, and so no one's documenting. That to
Right.
me is there, it's not even in the brief process, if you will.
Yeah, I
So,
think so too.
and
And
I
I
think,
gave you some examples as well.
yeah, I mean, I think if what happens and people are wrong is like we said earlier, you rework, right? It can impact schedule. There's always this downstream consequences as well, like especially with creative briefs for design. If that doesn't get worked out and the assets don't get created, then the web team and the email team and the social team, their time is crunched, right? They're always the
Mm-hmm.
compressed people at the end of the
Always.
cycle.
It's so true.
So even in a small business, you're going to be, even if you're one or two people, I feel like if you work everything out up front kind of thing and you really have that clear, then your project management of yourself is going to
Right.
go a lot simpler, and you're not going to be at the last moment trying to get stuff updated or uploaded or whatever, right? So,
Yeah, you just made me think of an example of something too. So, a client had asked me, I need an email to go out, and she had like, this is who it has to go to. And I was like, what does it say? And I'm like, what is the purpose of it? And so, a couple days goes by, and then she tells me what the purpose is, and then I ask some more questions. So we're literally, it's like days and weeks are going by of like,
right,
it didn't seem like it was that urgent because she would have like responded a lot quicker. And then and then I the probing that I continue to do, she finally realized, oh, I don't need this. This is not what I need. I need to do
right,
something else. And I'm like, yeah. So it does help. Like it's good to define things so that you like, do you really need sometimes you think
right.
you need something and you don't actually.
Yeah,
So
exactly. So
um
what would you say if you, I hate this term because I think it sounds like 2015, because we used to talk about killer features and killer benefits or whatever, but what do you think the killer creative brief looks like? Like what is the anatomy of a really solid creative brief for, let's say, design? But this, I think, could, you could remove the word creative and say any brief, but
yeah, I mean, just basics about like what is this project. Maybe you give an overview or some background of it because that's helpful if there's context. Because if somebody just says we need to do this, you're like, well, why? Is there a do you have any kind of context for that? Goals. So that's something that I'd asked that person. I was like, what are your goals for wanting to send out this email? I think that's good to know. Um,
and maybe goals and how you're going to measure the goals, right?
Yeah, if it's not evident, like I think sometimes it might be. So, I need to send an email to get people to sign up for something. So, that's the goal is to kind of get people to sign up. So sometimes it's obvious,
Sure.
but you can have that in there. It
I
doesn't
think
hurt.
it, I mean, I say let's have a box that says need tracking or need to, like it's more of a check, you and your
Always be
checklist. But
tracking.
yeah,
Always be
but just
tracking.
making sure that if they are, again, you probably shouldn't do this if there isn't goals or measurable objectives, but it might be something that it's offline, let's say, and you're not necessarily going to know its effectiveness on a digital level. But anyway,
No, but let's say using the example of maybe people have to sign up in person or they have to go to something in person, and you still could track that. So it
hmm,
just might not be, you know,
UTM
so
codes and Google
yeah,
Analytics and all those things.
yeah, have a QR code on a person or something. Yeah. Who is it for? So if you identify, who the target audience is,
Right.
what are the
What are they?
messages?
Yeah.
Huh?
What did
What?
they, proof points and pain points and things like that for that
That's, I think, part of
audience?
the I think that's part of the messaging, though. It's like,
Oh,
what
okay.
is it? You know what I mean? Like, I think it's good to know. I don't know. I guess it could be either because you wouldn't have that be customer facing. It's just like
No, you
that might be
wouldn't.
about their profile. Yeah,
Right.
that's fair. Um, and then what are the deliverables? I mean, I think that's kind of the obvious thing. So if it's a big campaign, maybe it's gonna be a list of things. But if it is a tier two or tier three, it might be just like we're updating, we're sending out an email or we're updating the website, or it could be like a little one-off thing it's just kind of easier to
Right.
identify. Um, I always think it's good to have timing in there. So it's kind of like,
Oh,
when are
but
we going to
that's
get this
easy.
done?
Yesterday.
Yeah. And if there's a budget as
Zero.
part of it, then yeah.
Zero. No budget.
And then sometimes you need to identify if it is a bigger one. I think you have to identify maybe there's a single person that is responsible for approving the overall thing, but maybe you have different people that are involved. They're either contributors or they're even like approvers for certain things. So maybe
Yeah.
somebody's an approver for the website, somebody else is for email, or so I think if you identify those things, because again, if you get to a point where people are arguing about something, you can go, oh, this is
I
who is
think
responsible for that.
probably less happen in a small business, but a small business could still have quite a few people, right? A couple, two or three people, or at
Sure.
least maybe the marketing team of three, kind of thing. So there might be some hierarchy that you need to make sure everyone's informed or
Yeah,
whatever.
there is usually, you kind of have to have checks and balances in my mind. So
Yeah.
the person who is executing on something, I feel like at least have somebody, a second set of eyes to proofread or, gut check.
And I just realized it's sort of a lot of companies have companies within companies. So you
What do
could
you
have
mean?
you might have a particular area that's focused on one project or one program or one product line. And there's a
Oh,
like complete set of
sure.
um, of a business architecture, if you will, under there, right? So there's
Mm,
marketers, there's advertisers, there's
hmm
you might have a team, small team within a team kind of thing. And so again, stakeholders could
I'm
be that as well.
Yeah, I was just thinking I'm giving feedback on a product, and they the product team told me, so you're the marketing persona. And it was so weird for them to identify me as a persona. I was like, okay. So that's a whole other topic. But
Okay.
anyway, maybe we cut
Persona non grata.
that. Yeah. So, are there things that people should avoid doing that we should address?
Probably. And I mean, I think you don't want to create this document first to be so like long or complicated, right? It's
Yeah, it'll be
um
boring.
boring or someone's going to miss something, right?
They're
If it's
not going to look at it.
buried. Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. And so I think keeping things concise, maybe pulling up like the key things, again, thinking about like timelines, like if that's buried and it's actually really short or it's really long, like that gives you a sense of how much time you have to sort of iterate and be creative and things like that. And then
That's true.
I think anytime you can use a tool to either develop it together, it could be as simple as like a Google Doc kind of thing,
Yeah.
and everybody has access and can edit it, and you have the nice thing is who changed something, and you can be like go back a version, whatever. But also thinking about a tool that lets you actually do like project management as well, and it may be that you handle some of your smaller requests just through a project management tool with a simple template, And I've seen that work effectively for, like you said, things that are repetitive, things that you do often, like weekly updates or maybe a monthly email. You can use it more of a tool. And then I guess the other thing, and we always say this, like do your research, have data, look at your competitors, right? See what they're doing, make sure. Do you have any other ones?
Well, it's funny. So again, I think that's the tier three things. It's like sometimes it's just a quick, just get it done, just do it sort of situation. So that might not be there. I would also say be a little bit flexible.
Mm.
So don't have these briefs or these templates for a brief be so locked down that it doesn't leave any room for creativity. So, and let it evolve, because over time you might think, oh, we actually should include this information or that
But do you
information.
think that there's a a point where you have to say stop or freeze
Yeah,
or
yes. And I find that it's not about the brief, it's usually the execution part
mm,
where I see multiple reviews happening and little tiny little tweaks happening where it's not a good use of time. So I don't see that on the brief side. I see that later usually.
yeah, I do like it though if part of the brief says we have this much time and we want this many reviews, right?
Yes, it should be
And
spelled out.
you're either setting expectations or you're pushing back and saying, well, if you want this in a week, there's no way we can do 3 cycles, right? Or whatever, right? So I
Yeah.
think that you're right. It needs to have some flexibility.
Hmm.
I'm not sure it should be, it's more about like, you may not be able to answer every question. And I think as the marketer, if the stakeholder says, I'm not sure I can answer every question, you can say, well, answer what you can. Oops, sorry. And we'll have a conversation. Like you said, you talk to somebody and you walk them through their thinking. You
Hmm.
were really just a sounding board. And then they said, oh, I don't even need this, but you might be able to help someone. But I would also say to that person, okay, this is fine, but I can't really start this until these things are identified or known. And I
Hmm.
think that's the other where this comes into play again is this process and timeline thing. It's like, I'd love to work on this, but I can't work on something that's half baked.
Yeah, exactly. And as a matter of fact, one thing that we didn't even kind of talk about is who's a creative brief for?
Oh,
And and
true.
I think there's, again, sometimes it's you're a solopreneur and you're doing everything yourself and you're putting things down, and so it's just for the sake of getting your thoughts clear.
Hmm.
But in tier 3 or tier 2 or tier 3, you might be working with a third party, an agency, a
Hmm.
consultant like you or I, and it's for them. It's just like you might have a lot of stuff in your head and you have to put it in writing, because otherwise it's, again, this churn that can happen if you're not clear. And then it's like you ask for something, you give it a brief, and then they come back with some solution and you're like, that is not at all what I had envisioned. And it's kind of
Yeah.
like, well, it starts with the brief, so having a really good
Well,
brief saves
and,
time.
and you just made me think also, how many times have you been, has someone come to you and said, I want this, and they show you somebody else's creative or somebody else's website or web page or somebody else's email, and they're basically locking you in into this predefined look and feel, and without any real thought over, well, who is that
I want
for?
it to look like Apple.
Yeah. Well, or it could be really amorphous like that as well. Or I
Yeah.
had somebody one time tell me, we created a web page for a product, and he's like, it needs to be cooler. Like, what does that mean?
It's so hard. So
I'm
that's another
like,
thing. Little feedback for people that are working with creative people. You have to try to be objective when you give your feedback, because it's hard when you say things like that.
yeah,
Make it more make it more inspiring.
and don't be vague. Like, if cool to use means colors, it might mean,
Motorcycles.
yeah, it might be movement. You might want animation. You might, you want something that looks a little more a word like modern is better than cool, like, because everyone's definition of cool is different a little bit, but if you said, I want this to look art deco, I don't know, or craftsman style, or if you're thinking about home design.
Well, as a matter of fact, that's a good use case. So not just with business, but also if you're working with some, like a designer, like you
Yeah,
can,
absolutely.
because it's very hard to just be like, oh, I want it to look like, whatever. If you have a way
That's
to
a really
articulate.
good point.
Yeah.
We did a closet remodel a few years ago during COVID, and we put in one of those whole like organized closets with
Mm-hmm.
drawers and
Mm-hmm.
very. We're like, oh, and we So we talked about what the goal was, which in my case was I wanted everything I need to change clothes in the
Yep.
closet. I didn't
Yep.
want to have to go to the
Yeah.
bedroom,
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
stuff out of a dresser,
Uh
have
huh.
half of my stuff over there and half,
Uh
but I
huh.
was okay with seasonally changing content.
Sure.
So like
Content.
holiday sweaters, content,
My.
clothing, content.
Do you have more shoes
Talk
than
like a
Susan?
designer.
I bet you do.
I do.
Yeah, I thought so.
But
That's so funny.
I have to wear nicer shoes like every day almost.
That's true. That's true.
And
That's very funny. I redid my closet as well, and my experience was we didn't have a brief per se, but the designer asked me great questions. She was looking at all my stuff, and she was like identifying the things I had in my existing closet, and she's like, "Where are other things that you usually go to get?" I'm like, "Oh, that's in that closet over there. That's in that drawer." And so she took all
exactly,
that and
exactly.
consolidated it, and I was like, "Ah."
She's
I'm
like,
so happy.
yeah.
So
I'm like,
happy.
well,
I'd like show people that. That's like my like the thing I'm most proud of in my house. I'm like, you got to go see my bedroom closet. I
I
love
should
it.
come. Have I seen your bedroom
I don't
closet?
know if you have. I don't know. I mean, I did it a
I
long
think
time ago, but
you.
I don't remember the
I
last time you were
have you
here.
seen ours? I don't know. Yeah, it's really
I
strange. It's
doubt
like
it.
I don't want it. Like that's like a someone else's special domain. But
Right.
yeah, no,
Well, because I
I.
only went to your new house once, and we
Oh, okay.
certainly, I don't think you were like, here's my closet. I don't think
Okay.
that was part of the tour.
Yeah, so you're right. The designer asked us lots of good questions, but before we even met with them, they asked us to fill out sort of these questionnaire. And it really
Oh,
was ultimately
that's
like
what
a
it is.
creative brief.
That's a
Yeah,
brief. And then we did look at, I mean, they had kind of limited fixtures and stuff. But I could say I lean towards a modern aesthetic. And so they can say, okay, here's the ones that fit that, so it makes it
exactly.
a little
So I
easier.
think that all that being said is the more specific you are and the less vague and the more you have thought, again, it comes down to thinking about something and coming up with what the end goal is and what the end feeling is, the experience that you talked about, the customer experience. So
Exactly.
I think there you want to make sure that ultimately, I think it's sort of in summary, is that a brief becomes a strategic necessity. In other words, you get in the habit of putting these things together, but don't do it to the point where it's going to make your essentially impact the way you do your business, right? So you don't want to have to force yourself to fill out this really long brief when it might not be necessary, but give yourself some thinking around how define your own levels, I guess that's what I'm saying, and then figure out what you need at the different levels. Because if you are, like you said, a solopreneur, really all you're doing is helping yourself put it out on paper, if you will, so that you have something to reference. But it is if you're working with someone externally, an agency, a consultant, or a company, this is an absolute. You have to have stuff like this so that you're not, um, working sort of in the dark and in very ambiguously and things like that.
Hmm. And then I would say there's nothing wrong with using templates like in Canva or Adobe Express where it's something that you do over and over again. So again, maybe you have an event once a quarter and you want to promote it with flyers or have that creative, whatever you have in your flyer, you also have it in an email to promote it. So, but I would recommend like make sure it aligns with your brand because
I
that's
was
the
just
thing that
gonna
I
say we
people
didn't
don't
touch
do
on the
that.
fact that part of what a creative brief needs to point to your brand book,
I think
whatever
we
that
did.
looks like.
Yeah, we did mention that it needs to kind of align with your brand, but Canva and Express both have this notion of a brand kit. So if you refer to that, it's got all your colors, it's got your fonts, it's got
Hmm,
your logos, and it's like you just have to keep going back to that because people will just literally grab a template and they don't make any adjustments to make it look
right,
like your brand.
like the
And
PowerPoint ones.
it's just awful. It makes me crazy.
And
I
then I
think I have a
think
lot of craziness.
craziness, and
Craziness.
we would love to hear if anybody out there has any crazy like creative brief stories, horror stories or ones where you adopted a creative brief or some sort of briefing process and it really helped or whatever. So if you have something you want to share, you can always go to itsmostlymarketing.com and ask the host and send us a question or a comment. And oftentimes we try to answer them on the air here.
Yep.
So
You can also put comments in YouTube, so feel free to add it there.
absolutely.
And also, we need to get more subscribers. A lot of you are watching and listening, but you're not subscribed. So make sure you subscribe wherever
Please
you get
subscribe.
podcasts or on YouTube. It would really help us out a lot.
Absolutely.
So, from tangents to tactics.
It's mostly marketing.